Thank you for inviting me. And I would urge those of you who have not had a chance to read Arjun's paper to really read it. He's always a delight to read, and this one is no less than the previous ones that I've enjoyed with him. He has this wonderful way of using words which are everyday words, and yet the way he puts them together brings out new meaning in them that I always continue to find impressive. Now he ends with a very nice proposition. He says, let 1,000 failures bloom and the successes will take care of themselves. So I was wondering if Chairman Mao would agree with this, or whether he would say this reformulation is moving away from the kind of directed dialectical materialism that was needed to get the outcomes that he wanted from the deliberative process that he led. Let me start off by saying that I strongly endorse Arjun's formulation of the problem of context. I think that is very appropriate. He discusses the need for understanding context, and yet not over-problematizing the limitations of context and when can change occur. So I really enjoyed that. And he says that the political economy of felicity, as he uses the term, Austin's term, arises out of extra deliberative politics, unequal power relations, access to information or lack thereof, and the structure of distributive policy making. Who decides who gets what, right? However, he also argues that deliberative frames can change and do change. So for me, the interesting question is, under what circumstances are frames themselves the object of deliberation? When does one question the frame? And under what circumstances can the frames be reframed? Right? I enjoyed his distinction between what he calls performatives, Austin's performatives, and constitutives, but found this to be a little distracting. So he cites the statement, I now pronounce you man and wife. It has meaning. It is not just words. But so does the statement, talak, 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 right? I divorce thee, I divorce thee, I divorce thee. This is very sort of context specific. They both have the same power. One binds couples together, the other unbinds them. They're simply words. So the question is, why do these words matter? In what context? And what gives them that power which makes them work while other words remain words, right? Therefore, which words do we remember and why? Let me move beyond the domain of linguistics, where I will not compete with Arjun. I still recognize him as my guru, right? Towards the domain of institutional frames, where I do consider to have dabbled a bit more, right? And I have some vignettes to sort of test where I want to go with this. Now, in the discussion on deliberative democracy, which was originally coined by Joseph Bessette in 1980, he sort of discusses this in the context of other democratic processes. Deliberative democracy recognizes a conflict of interest between the citizen who's participating and the group entity who organizes these processes or organizes this decision. Therefore, it usually involves an outreach by someone to someone in order to get a process going. It's not organic. It doesn't start by itself. There is an interaction which goes beyond the poor organizing themselves, and it is that interaction that we need to look at. What happens? Who provides the space for this deliberation? Right? So there are two sets of actors. And if we take both examples that he talks about, briefly he mentions Panchayati Raj in India, and he also mentions the slum and shack dweller federations. Both of them were processes that had outside sponsors which allowed that to happen. Right? You did not get the poor organizing themselves into deliberative processes without that sponsorship. One characteristic to keep in mind. The other thing to keep in mind is that at least some of the critics from the more libertarian tradition talk about a flaw in deliberative democracy, which can be summarized as the tyranny of the majority. And they argue that individual rights can suffer from that. A classic example of that is deliberative democracy in, say, South Asia, often leads to disadvantageous position of women, which is sanctified by society and by the state, right? And in Pakistan, for example, minority rights are acutely sort of under stress, and it is sanctified by society. So not all deliberative processes are neutral, and not all of them will give the same rights to everybody. Let's keep this in mind. So I have three examples, all three from Pakistan, and I may not be able to go into these in great detail, but I just want to cite them to sort of come to my conclusion on what those conditions might be under which these processes actually get traction. The first is, if I'm right, 1983, when the Hudud Ordinance was introduced, which is a law giving less legal rights to women than to men, right? Or giving more rights to men than to women. There has been a very strong movement now for the last 27 years to try to repeal it, with various periods of street unrest and protests, and occasionally, intermittently, the government setting up commissions on how to restore the law. Every time the proposals to restore the law move from these deliberations into parliament, somebody stands up and speaks and says, but this is against religion, and it goes back to the drawing board again, right? So there are internal contradictions between sources of legitimacy which give rise to sources of power who are able to subvert this process, right? And the question is, despite a lot of talk and a lot of deliberation, why has it not yet changed, right? Despite some governments, two rules of Benazir Bhutto, a woman prime minister, and a general who was very committed to this, he couldn't get it through parliament. Second, in Swat, which I hope all of you have heard of by now, since 2009, there was a judicial movement for imposition of Sharia law. Now, the history of this is actually more interesting than what happened last year. It goes back to 1974, when the Kingdom of Swat was abolished and the area was declared part of Pakistan. However, there was a transition period of 20 years, during which period civil law would not be imposed. In 1994, civil law was supposed to be imposed in that part of the country. And when that happened, people protested because they saw what was happening in the parts of the country where civil law was working, which is that nobody believed justice was done. People believed justice was delayed. It was expensive. And therefore, they said, this is not acceptable to us.